What really happened when Oprah mocked John Kennedy's faith on live TV shocked everyone, but it was his response that left her utterly speechless. The moment began innocently enough, a lighthearted interview about personal values and public service. But Oprah, perhaps seeking a viral moment or edgy twist, pressed Kennedy with a smirk. "Do you really believe God still talks to people like you?" Laughter rippled from the audience, unsure whether it was a jab or a joke. Kennedy blinked slowly. The atmosphere turned tense. Cameras zoomed in. The show's producers weren't expecting controversies, certainly not faith-based tension on daytime television. But Kennedy didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, voice low and firm. And what he said next didn't just silence Oprah, stunned a nation used to polished platitudes and nervous deflections. His words weren't scripted. They were rooted. And their impact would linger long after the applause faded. Kennedy didn't speak with fire, spoke with steel. "Ms. Winfrey," he began, calm and unwavering, "faith isn't about sound bites or certainty. It's about listening when the world's screaming and believing anyway." The crowd stilled. Even Oprah's smile faltered. Continued. "I've stood beside graves, sat with grieving parents, and held hands with folks who had nothing left but their belief. You asked me if I think God still talks?" He looked directly into the camera. I think he never stopped. "We just got too loud to hear him." A hush fell over the room. The audience that had laughed a minute ago now leaned forward, spellbound. Oprah, legendary for her composure, blinked several times, visibly rattled. She tried to pivot, but Kennedy wasn't finished. "Faith isn't about explaining everything," he said. "It's about standing anyway, even when the storm don't pass." Social media exploded. Within minutes, the clip went viral. The hashtag Kennedy, clap back, trended globally. Commentators debated whether Oprah's question was fair or disrespectful. But nearly all agreed on one thing. Kennedy's answer was unshakably sincere. Even critics were caught off guard. One blogger wrote, "I don't agree with his politics, but that man believes what he says, and that's rare." Conservative circles rallied behind him instantly. Church leaders from across denominations praised his restraint and conviction. Meanwhile, Oprah's team scrambled to control the narrative, claiming it was a misunderstood joke. But the damager. Transformation was already done. Kennedy had exposed something raw, that in an age of polished disbelief, unpolished belief still carried weight. The next day, Kennedy returned to Capitol Hill, quiet and unaffected by the media whirlwind. But his office was swamped with flowers, letters, and phone calls. Veterans, pastors, single mothers, even atheists wrote to say they'd felt something in his words they hadn't heard in years. "You didn't defend God," one letter read. "You testified without preaching." He read each message slowly, thoughtfully, storing them in a drawer he labeled simply, "Keep." Despite the public storm, Kennedy stayed grounded. He didn't call press conferences or tweet victory. When reporters cornered him, he just said, "I didn't respond for applause. I responded because silence would have meant I agreed." It wasn't a performance, it was a reckoning. He knew the cost of conviction, but he also knew the cost of cowardice. For him, the latter was always too high to pay. Meanwhile, Oprah remained silent for days, an unusual move. Behind the scenes, sources said she was shaken by the backlash. She wasn't used to being the one caught off guard. Her publicist released a soft apology, carefully worded and non-committal. But by then, the moment had already moved beyond her. Kennedy was being booked for faith conferences, invited to podcasts, and praised in Sunday sermons. He turned most of it down. "I'm not a preacher," he told his team. "Just a man who's seen too much to stop believing." That authenticity made the moment last. In a world where most viral clips faded within hours, his lingered. It wasn't just about a senator standing up for faith. It was about someone refusing to be embarrassed by belief. In doing so, he gave others permission to stop apologizing. 2 late-night comedians tried to spin it into satire, but even their punchlines landed soft. The audience, still echoing from Kennedy's raw words, didn't laugh quite as easily. One host said, "That moment wasn't about politics. It was about something deeper, and I don't think we're used to that anymore, viewers wrote. In asking for reruns of the segment, it's demanding to see the moment that had quieted even Oprah. Meanwhile, Kennedy kept working, meeting with constituents, pushing bills and visiting community centers. But something had shifted. Everywhere he went, people didn't just shake his hand. They looked him in the eye, grateful. Not because he'd won a debate, but because he'd stood still when most would have danced around discomfort. That stillness had power. And he was just beginning to understand how deep that power ran. Churches invited him to speak, not as a politician, but as a witness. At a small Baptist church in Georgia, he read the same verses his grandmother used to recite. He sang a hymn with the choir, voice cracking on the last line. People wept not for the song, but for the honesty. Kennedy never tried to sound perfect, just tried to sound true. After the service, a teenage boy approached him, eyes shining. I didn't think anyone in Washington still believed in anything, he said. Kennedy placed a hand on his shoulder. Belief don't start in Washington, son. It starts here, he said, tapping the boy's chest. Moments like these kept coming. Quiet, personal, profound, and Kennedy didn't publicize them. He just lived them. They, in turn, lived on. In the people he touched, back on Capitol Hill, some colleagues mocked him behind closed doors. St. Kennedy, they joked. But even they lowered their voices when he entered a room. Something about him had changed, or maybe something had been revealed. He didn't bark during hearings anymore. He spoke slowly, with patience, like a man who knew the weight of words. He didn't seek battles, but when they came, he met them without flinching. One aide said, "He's not louder, he's deeper." And that depth drew attention. New alliances formed, unexpected ones. That moment had become more than a clip-it, was now a cultural touchstone. A reminder that belief could still spark awe in the most unlikely places. Soon, Kennedy's name began surfacing in conversations about leadership beyond the Senate. Some urged him to run for higher office. Others begged him to write a book. But Kennedy wasn't interested in capitalizing. The moment wasn't about me, he told a reporter. It was about a truth bigger than us both. Still the pressure mounted. Every appearance drew larger crowds. Faith leaders called him a voice of courage. Youth groups quoted his words. Even Oprah's longtime fans began re-examining their thoughts on faith in public life. Kennedy never gloated. He never criticized her either. When asked directly if he forgave Oprah, he simply said, "She gave me a question. I gave her my truth. I figure we're even." That answer, humble and firm, only added to his legend. In private, though, Kennedy remained a man of routine. He still read scripture each morning, still walked the halls of the Capitol with purpose. But now, he carried more than policy papers. He carried expectation. People looked to him not just for leadership, but for reassurance. And he gave it not through grand speeches, but through steady presence. When an earthquake hit a southern town, he was there within hours, not with a camera crew, but with work gloves and a prayer. When asked why he kept showing up, he shrugged. A man who's been given a voice ought to use it for more than his own story. That, perhaps, was the heart of it all. Kennedy didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a vessel. And when you're a vessel, what you carry matters more than who you are. As the months passed, Kennedy's influence deepened, not through legislation, but through lives quietly changed. A high school teacher in Indiana wrote to him saying she had played the Oprah interview for her class. They stopped texting, she wrote. They listened, and then they asked questions. Real ones. That letter meant more to him than any campaign endorsement. He began carrying certain letters in his coat pocket, rereading them on long flights or late nights at his desk. These weren't fan messages. They were confessions, thank yous, echoes of pain and hope sent to a man who never asked to be a symbol. But Kennedy knew better than to run from it. He embraced the burden, because in every word of doubt, someone wrote him. He saw a door one he could gently open with faith, patience, and the right words at the right time. That became his mission, not to be famous, but to be faithful. Meanwhile, Oprah surprised everyone by inviting Kennedy back. She extended the invitation in a handwritten letter delivered to his office. "You showed me something I didn't expect that day," she wrote, "and I think the world needs to hear more." The other letters he treasured. He didn't respond immediately. He prayed. He consulted his team. And then, without fanfare, he accepted. "This time, it needs to feel sacred," she told producers. Word spread fast. Viewers tuned in by the millions. There were no jokes, no jabs, just two people facing each other again, this time with deeper understanding. Oprah opened the conversation with a simple sentence, "I misjudged you." Kennedy nodded and replied, "Maybe you just needed to see what faith looks like when it doesn't ask for applause." The interview became a masterclass in humility. Kennedy spoke not about himself, but about others. Told stories of families he'd met, letters he'd received, strangers whose hearts had touched his own. Oprah listened, really listened. At one point, visibly moved, she asked, "How do you keep your faith so intact when everything around you is falling apart?" Kennedy smiled faintly. "Because it's never depended on everything being okay. It depends on knowing I'm not alone even when everything's wrong." That line hit like thunder. The audience didn't cheer, they exhaled. Collective moment of stillness. A sense that something rare had just passed between two people on a stage. Truth without armor. The episode would go on to be one of the most watched in her show's history. But more importantly, it marked a turning point not just for Oprah and Kennedy, but for public discourse itself. Following the second interview, Kennedy was no longer just a senator. He had become a touchstone for something many felt was missing from public life: conviction without cruelty, belief without arrogance. Churches, mosques, temples, even synagogues began referencing his words. A rabbi in Chicago quoted him during Yom Kippur services. An imam mentioned him during Friday prayers. What Kennedy had sparked wasn't division, it was dialogue. Faiths that had once eyed each other with suspicion now used his moment as a bridge. "If he can speak truth in a hostile space," one pastor said, "maybe we can listen harder. In our own," that ripple effect spread quietly beneath headlines and hashtags, and Kennedy watched, humbled. He hadn't planned this. But then again, neither had Moses when he picked up the staff. Sometimes purpose finds you, not the other way around. Still, the pressure mounted. The more people elevated Kennedy, the more others sought to drag him down. Old speeches were dissected, quotes taken out of context. Late-night pundits accused him of hiding behind religion. A leaked memo claimed he planned to run for president on a faith-first ticket, something he immediately denied. "I know I'm not running for anything but peace," he told a reporter. The scrutiny didn't rattle him, but it did weigh on him. Privately, he began limiting public appearances. He declined book deals, television offers, even a Netflix series. "My faith isn't content," he said. "It's covenant." His staff worried that he was retreating. But Kennedy wasn't withdrawing. He was preserving, guarding the well. That had filled so many others, because he knew, if that well ran dry, his words would become noise like everyone else's. Despite the noise, his quiet influence only grew stronger. A national youth conference featured him on a virtual panel, where he answered student questions for over 2 hours. One girl asked, "What do you do when prayer doesn't fix anything?" Kennedy's answer, "Then I pray not to fix but to survive." That line went viral. Guidance counselors printed it on posters. The youth pastors built sermons around it, but Kennedy didn't notice. We had already moved on to the next conversation, the next letter, the next hand to hold. He believed words mattered, but only when they served the heart, not the ego. That posture made him unshakable. He wasn't interested in defending his faith. He was interested in living it. And that difference, subtle but powerful, turned him into something Washington rarely produced, a man whose truth didn't waver in a storm. Eventually, universities began offering honorary degrees. He turned down most of them, but he accepted one from a small Christian college in Mississippi where his father once taught Sunday school. During his speech, he didn't mention politics at all. Instead, he talked about silence. "The kind that comes after grief," he said. "The kind that comes before peace." He paused, then added, I've learned that silence isn't the absence of faith, it's where faith waits for you. That speech was recorded on a student's phone and uploaded later, garnering millions of views within days. Kennedy never watched it. He was too busy helping a neighbor repair a roof or visiting a hospice where a dying woman asked to hear him sing. He didn't see his story as a brand. He saw it as borrowed breath. That made all the difference. His influence even reached the White House. The president, during a national prayer breakfast, referenced Kennedy's original quote from Oprah's show. "Maybe we've just gotten too loud to hear him." The crowd gave a standing ovation. Kennedy, seated in the back, remained still. He wasn't moved by praise. What moved him was truth. And he knew truth didn't need volume, it needed witness. After the breakfast, aides approached him, urging him to capitalize on the momentum. "You've got a platform most men dream of," one said. Kennedy smiled. "Got a platform that makes men weep. That's better." He never confused power with purpose. In that quiet separation, he preserved what others often lost: integrity. A man who answered a mocking question with dignity had become a moral compass in an age that desperately needed direction. But even compasses wear down. Kennedy's health began to falter. Nothing dramatic, just fatigue that lingered, aches that stayed longer than they should. Doctors warned him to slow down. His staff begged him to rest, but he kept showing up at shelters, schools, vigils. "I'll rest when I'm no longer needed," he'd joke. But deep inside, he knew his time was running short. That urgency didn't make him frantic. It made him focused. He began writing letters not to donors or politicians, but to people. Ordinary people who had written him over the years. He replied to each one by hand, sometimes with a scripture, sometimes with a lyric, sometimes just with silence. Because even silence, when given sincerely, can be holy, especially from a man who had once taught the world how to hear again. One such letter went to Oprah. In it, he wrote, "You gave me a moment. I gave you a mirror. And somehow, we both came away seeing clearer." She framed it in her office, calling it the most profound note she ever received. When asked later if she regretted her question that day, she shook her head. "It gave him a pulpit," she said, "and gave the rest of us a sermon we didn't know we needed." Kennedy never replied again. He didn't need to. It's final. Words like his faith spoke best when left to linger. And across the country, in quiet homes, busy streets, loud debates, and soft pews, his voice lived on, not shouting, not preaching, just reminding that faith isn't always understood, but when it is lived well, it leaves even the loudest voices speechless. As news of Kennedy's declining health spread, tributes quietly poured in. He didn't want fanfare, but it came anyway in the form of silent candles, handwritten notes, and children's choirs singing the hymn he once sang after Oprah's interview. Across the country, people weren't mourning yet, they were honoring. One woman left a single white lily on the steps of the Capitol with a note, "You taught me it's okay to still believe." Kennedy read every story his staff printed out, but he said little. His focus wasn't on what the world would remember. It was on what it still needed. One evening, he told his closest aide, "I don't want to be remembered for what I said. I want to be remembered for what I didn't walk away from." That line would later be etched onto a stone outside his childhood church. A reminder not of perfection, but of presence. In his final weeks, Kennedy requested no cameras, no visitors outside family and longtime friends. Yet people still gathered outside his home in silence, holding candles and humming the hymn he'd made famous. Inside, he sat by a window, guitar across his lap, too weak to play. Still, he'd whisper lyrics now and then, familiar lines about storms passing and valleys rising. Hospice nurses called him the calmest soul they'd ever seen. He'd smile and say, "I've just made peace with the fact that peace was always with me." One night, a thunderstorm rolled in. Lightning lit the sky, and he whispered, "Even now he's speaking." Those were his last words. He passed just before dawn, not with struggle, but with a breath that felt like the closing verse of a long, faithful song. News of his passing sent ripples across the nation. Flags were lowered, churches rang bells. Oprah canceled her regular bratza and instead aired a montage of Kennedy's appearances, voice trembling as she introduced it. "He challenged me in front of the world," she said, "and I am forever grateful he did." From governors to gas station clerks, people posted their stories. One teenage boy from a foster home wrote, "He answered my letter. No one ever had before." Another woman shared a photo of her grandmother watching his second Oprah interview, tears rolling down her cheeks. She hadn't believed in anything. For years, the caption read, "Until that day, Kennedy had left behind no political movement, no campaign slogan. What he left behind was rarer, belief, born from bruises, shared without shame. His funeral was private, just as he'd wished. No broadcast, no dignitaries. Just family, a few old friends, and the choir from that Mississippi church. They sang it as well with my soul, the hymn he had once hummed to comfort a stranger outside a flood shelter." But outside the gates, thousands gathered. People from all walks of life, Democrats, Republicans, Christians, skeptics stood, shoulder to shoulder, holding hands. No protests, no shouting, just quiet remembrance. Someone played a recording of Kennedy's voice, reciting his most famous line, "Maybe we've just gotten too loud to hear him."
Ah!
And in that moment, no. One spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because they knew they